For 500 years or so, smokers in their millions have been enjoying the pleasures of tobacco, regardless of the anti-smoking activists who have been striving to stop them. King James I of England issued his renowned counterblast against tobacco. Popes in Rome, sultans in Turkey, and czars in Russia all issued edicts against it. Whipping was often the punishment for a first smoking offence, and execution for a second. In the first 350 years of tobacco's history, more than 30 countries passed laws to ban it, and then repealed them, perhaps not infrequently because their own rulers discovered for themselves the pleasures of smoking. But the more often the anti-smoking activists have failed in their mission, the more vociferous and determined has been their pursuit of it, with increasing use of statistical reports claiming that smokers were risking their health, all aimed at persuading them to quit. But smokers in their millions weighed up the arguments, decided to accept any risk factor that might exist, and continued to enjoy smoking. So then the activists decided they must try something else. And that's when they started to say that smoking was an antisocial pastime which can harm people other than the smoker through so-called passive smoking. Yet there is plentiful scientific evidence to dispute this theory too.
Risk associated with an exposure to ETS, if it does exist, is too low to be detected by epidemiological method.
People have done studies where trying to estimate what non-smokers are exposed to in typical environments. These calculations show that a typical non-smoker would be exposed to the equivalent of less than 1 cigarette per year.
In the face of that kind of expert opinion, why did the activists persist in attacking environmental tobacco smoke?
It provided something which the anti-smoking movement absolutely needed, namely the innocent bystander. The innocent bystander is necessary because it provides a very powerful justification for government intervention. The innocent bystander had to be found.
Really, in a somewhat sinister way, anti-smoking campaigners have actively chosen to campaign on the basis of the possible dangers of environmental tobacco smoke. They're using this as a way of persuading smokers not to smoke. And I really question the scientific integrity of this.
It is fashionable to uphold certain causes, and a lot of people sign on to a bandwagon or they adopt a cause not necessarily because it is the right, the just, or the proper thing to do, not always because they have thought very deeply or seriously about the issue, but because they gain a certain amount of virtue points by associating themselves with the cause.
We at the media, we cover crashes, we don't cover landings, okay? And so environmental scenarios of doom play well. Environmental scenarios of non-doom, of learning that there is no doom, that's not very big news.
And the activists do have a knack of sidestepping any scientific facts and findings they see as inconvenient. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, a government body of enormous power and influence, set a quite remarkable example in this respect with a report which brought the use of the blind eye to a fine art, looking at 30 studies of ETS from all over the world, and then failing to consider adequately the 24 of them which did not support the claim that it harms non-smokers.
We believe from the beginning the Environmental Protection Agency had a predetermined result. And despite the evidence that's out there and available, they wanted to make sure that they labeled ETS a human carcinogen.
Well, I think science has become politicized to a certain degree, so that studies that come out particularly from groups with scientific pedigree, but nevertheless lobbying groups, tend to take a particular position depending on the prejudice or the predisposition of the group or the author. And that has tended to make scientific findings more suspect. We can't trust them as easily as we could before.
They totally relied their information on weak statistical studies. 75% of these studies do not reach a level of what scientists call statistical significance.
And the agency seems not only to have ignored an entire body of prior scientific knowledge on ETS, but has even disregarded to some extent its own guidelines on cancer risk assessment as well. For its report admits to what is called some difficulty in applying the guidelines to this complex and variable mixture, meaning ETS. And one member of its Science Advisory Board suggests, therefore, not that the data should be judged by the guidelines, but the guidelines may need revising, which sounds uncommonly like changing the rules because you're losing the game. Then the EPA mistook even the very nature of the substance on which it was supposed to be reporting, treating ETS as being essentially equivalent to the mainstream smoke the smoker inhales.
The composition of the ETS is quite different from mainstream smoke. But even more important than that is that, of course, nobody, not even the smoker himself, is exposed to anything like the concentration of smoke constituents from ETS as he is exposed to from the mainstream smoke.
If these are far from the only basic flaws the scientific community has identified in the Environmental Protection Agency report, for there are literally dozens of others, it's by no means the first time the agency has come under fire.
EPA has been proven wrong again and again and again. In the last 2 years alone, we've seen the demise of their asbestos model, their dioxin model, their PCB model, their PBB model, the EDB model, one after another. It's just a parade of calamitous mistakes.
The EPA has had a long history of basing their decisions on politics and special interest groups as opposed to actual science. Environmental tobacco smoke is just another example of the EPA bowing to political pressures.
And of course, the EPA report is merely one example of the pressure tactics of a worldwide movement.
The ETS issue is just part of the general issue against smoking. And for this reason, one should not be surprised to see that there is a considerable degree of exaggeration. Now, I leave to you to tell me if this exaggeration is motivated or not. Scientifically, certainly not.
But it was the testimony of Dr. Jane Gravel, senior specialist of the Congressional Research Service, given before a U.S. Senate subcommittee in May 1994, that delivered the latest criticism of the EPA report, declaring that EPA had done no research of its own, but only took results from other studies, and adjusted the results of each study, had ignored studies that didn't fit into their analysis, and had relaxed scientific standards. As co-author of the CRS study, Dr. Gravel then testified, "Our evaluation was that the statistical evidence does not appear to support a conclusion that there are substantial health effects of passive smoking." The plain truth is that even before anybody lights a cigarette, indoor air is a cocktail of substances already. Fibers, dust, mites, spores, particles, chemicals, vapors, from clothes, carpets, fabrics, cookers, heaters, cleaning materials, pets, even scales from our skin and CO2 from our lungs. And in a poorly ventilated room, especially if it gets crowded, these substances can cause irritation, even though most of them are both invisible and odorless. Then somebody lights up. This will have very little additional effect on the air quality, bearing in mind the substances already present. But the difference is that ETS can be seen and smelled. So in an atmosphere already stuffy with odorless and invisible substances, it's the smoke that gets the blame. Yet how can this possibly be justified when the data to back it is so conspicuously lacking?
It's no good saying or trying to relate disease of that kind with what people were exposed to yesterday or last week. You have to go back at least 30 years, and probably, to be meaningful, back to childhood. And that sort of data never exists. It never exists for anything. It certainly doesn't exist for exposure to ETS or to other indoor or outdoor air pollutants.
Epidemiologists score various factors as relative cancer risks. 1 equals no increased risk, and anything below 3 is a weak association. Despite its condemnation of ETS, the EPA report rates its risk no higher than 1.19. Compare that with a relative risk score of 2 for eating fried bacon, for example, or 2.1 for drinking pasteurized milk, or 2.4 for the consumption of pork, and those are quite modest compared with some others, such as the keeping of pet birds, which carries a relative risk way up the scale at 6. And it's also interesting to note that while living in an electromagnetic field, such as near high-tension power lines, carries a risk score of 3 in respect of childhood leukemia, EPA doesn't seem to think it worthy even of mention as a potential carcinogen. But the contradictions don't end there. When the US National Cancer Institute announced in November 1994 that induced abortions create a relative risk of 1.5 for breast cancer, their press release was at pains to point out that in epidemiological research, relative risks of less than 2 are considered small and are usually difficult to interpret. Such increases may be due to chance, statistical bias, or effects of confounding factors that are sometimes not evident. So with responsible scientists agreed that any relative risks of less than 2 are considered small, what possible logic could have induced the EPA and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to use the ETS risk of only 1.19, the product of their own epidemiological studies, as the basis of a crusade to ban smoking in public places? Only the logic of political correctness, surely, could have brought forth so total a contradiction. Still, in some circumstances, other people's smoke can undoubtedly be a nuisance. The most reasonable of non-smokers may well object to the sight and smell of smoke when he's eating, for instance, and many will complain that the smell clings to hair, clothes, and furnishings. But does such a nuisance need laws to control it? Should we legislate in that case on garlic? Don't the answers lie rather in everyday common sense? Like if a room is stuffy or smoky, open a window. Or if it's a sealed building, make sure the ventilation is properly maintained and used. A great many aren't. Like providing separate areas in public eating places where space allows. And above all, like a little courtesy and a little tolerance. The courtesy of asking, "Do you mind if I smoke?" The tolerance that recognizes that smoking in an adequately ventilated space is a perfectly acceptable social activity. Philip Morris in Europe has invested considerable sums in promoting common sense, courtesy and tolerance. And so are national manufacturers' associations right across the continent. In the Netherlands, they even use TV.
Hey, psst. May I disturb you? What's your opinion about smoking during a meal? And after dessert?
Yeah.
Isn't there a law about it? Or isn't it better to work it out together? Order the free information pack from VSS 068310.
So let's all continue to play our part in promoting common sense. A little extra ventilation in our homes and workplaces if necessary. Separate eating areas where space allows. A little courtesy from smokers. A little tolerance from non-smokers. A two-way dialogue, in other words, not strident argument or megaphone diplomacy. But once we start to let the activists decide our choices for us, or still worse, influence our lawmaking, then freedom itself is on the line.
Environmental tobacco smoke is the flavor of the month or the year, but there are going to be other matters of similar importance to people's everyday lives, which could easily be attacked and dealt with the same careless disregard for the quality of the evidence.